My purple pen. Yeah. Okay. Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for not watching the Arizona Wildcat game right now. We appreciate you all being here. Welcome to the 6th Annual Tucson Festival of Books. I'm Beth Viner. We'd like to thank the City of Tucson for sponsoring this venue and also the University of Arizona College of Science for sponsoring this session. Presentation will last about an hour, including a little bit of time definitely for Q&A. So please hold your questions till the end. And at the conclusion of the session, Lily will be at a signing area if you'd like to meet her and have her autograph one of her books. Out of respect for the authors and everyone else here, please turn off your cell phones. And then we'll get started. So this is Lily Koppel. She actually joined me in escaping the polar vortex of New York City. So we're both super excited to be in Tucson this weekend. She's a best-selling author of The Red Leather Diary, which came out in 2008, as well as Astronaut Wives Club, which we're going to talk about today. She's written for the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, the Daily Beast, Huffington Post, and Glamour. She lives in New York City with her husband, although they spend a little bit of time every now and again in Woodstock, even though she just assured me she's not that hippie. And there are two rescue dogs, Ozzy and Lucky. So the Astronaut Wives Club is a great book. It's actually about the emotional side of the space race. And it really explores a bunch of strong women in the background who actually made it all possible. So I'm going to take it away. Hi. Welcome.
Really wonderful to be here.
Great to have you. So maybe we could just start off and you could just give a little bit of background about how you came up with this idea and why you, right? How did you decide this was going to be your book?
Sure. Well, moments of inspiration are always pretty interesting. My first book was called The Red Leather Diary, and that was when I was a young staff member at the New York Times, and I'd come out of my building and seen this dumpster full of old steamer trunks, climbed in and found this young woman's diary and eventually found her at 90. That was book number 1. So I had stumbled upon my first book in such a serendipitous way. When I was thinking about my topic for number 2, it was like,
how could you beat it?
Yeah, like when is lightning going to just strike me, basically? But I was sitting at home one Saturday and toying with working on a novel. And my husband and I had just bought this large coffee table book, just sort of for fun, called Of a Fire on the Moon, or Moonfire. It was Norman Mailer's opus about the Apollo 11 landings. And so I was just really enjoying sort of having a tomboy moment and looking at pictures of Neil Armstrong, planting the flag in the lunar surface, and Buzz Aldrin in this spacey, white marshmallow suit from the 1960s. And I turned a page, and all of a sudden I saw women wearing dresses the color that I'm now wearing, these sherbet-colored mini dresses and these skyrocketing beehives. And they were clustered around this model of the moon that was probably made out of plaster of Paris. And I just turned to my husband. We were in a huge Mad Men kick at the time. And I just said, has anything ever been done on the Astro Wives? As I then found out that they were called in headlines, and it just sort of took off from there. I just became absolutely obsessed with their story. And, the astronauts were engineer types, and the wives to this day constantly joke about how they were so tight-lipped and unemotional. Even back in the day, journalists would always want to know from Neil and Buzz and all the guys who had landed on the moon, well, what did it feel like? What did you dream about when you were up there? And the guys would always start spouting numbers and vectors. And the joke was like, oh, forget it, we're going to go talk to your wives. So I thought there has to be this whole emotional side of the story, as you mentioned. And I was just lucky enough that the women were still there and that they were willing, after some convincing, to talk to me. And that was sort of the launch of the book.
That was actually my next question, which was the women in their book, they're portrayed, they're pretty insular, and by design it feels like they've actually created a very safe place for themselves, given that the rest of their world was very, very public. So how did you kind of make your way into the group, and who'd you find your way to first?
Well, I found out that forming in the 60s, the title of the book actually is the Astronaut Wives Club, that there was this almost sorority among the spacemen's wives. They described themselves as space sisters that developed among them because they were sort of thrown into this media circus with very little coaching from NASA, and so they had to rely on each other. And so they would get together for these monthly martini hours and coffee and tea get-togethers and just sort of coach each other along in this brave new world of being an astronaut wife. But of course, they were very guarded, and these are high-level military wives. And I don't know, I just told them, that I found a great deal of significance in their story and that I wanted to approach it with a lot of integrity. And I think they knew time was of the essence. They're now in their 70s and 80s, and so, they just had to get on board, and they did.
Yeah.
And they helped each other sort of feel comfortable. Some women wanted to tell all. Maybe they'd been divorced from their astronaut after the space program, which was pretty prevalent among the group. And they sort of wanted a little bit of revenge, like the women's heroic tale. Others were still very proper astronaut wives. And, I just let each woman sort of guide how she wanted to tell her story.
Yeah. I know you brought a bunch of pictures, so I don't know if you want to share
Yes.
some of what you brought to give everyone a
Let's
sense
jump
of what it
in.
looks like.
Well, from these pictures, you'll sort of get a sense of what the Astronaut Wives world was like and also what inspired the writing of the book. Oops. Sorry. This is the group of 7 Mercury Wives, and these were sort of the founding wives. The Mercury 7 astronauts were announced on April 9th, 1959 to the whole country. And you have all of America and the world sort of looking to these new silver-suited astronauts who are basically, hopefully, going to beat the Russians into space. And not only was the country focused on their, the men and sort of this heroic feat, but it was so uncanny. We're going to send a man into space, these human cannonballs. And so there was this immediate attention to, well, what does your wife have to say about it? And all of the Mercury 7 families were offered a $500,000 contract from Life magazine to reveal the personal side of this extraordinary adventure. So you have women like Reen Carpenter, the wife of Scott Carpenter, who was blonde and vivacious and really sort of stepped into the limelight with a great deal of panache. Then you have other women like Betty Grissom, who is a bit more of a shrinking violet. But what I really was captivated with these group of women were that they were almost like our first reality TV stars. Here they are getting together, dishing about what their men are doing, which is highly unusual, but you also constantly have their experiences being recorded by the media.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the Real Housewives of Togethersville. Is that what's called?
Exactly. Well, all of the astronaut families lived in the space burbs of Houston around NASA's operations, and it was actually called Togethersville, and this was almost the Beverly Hills of astronauts. There would be literally tour buses that would wind their way through the subdivisions where Annie and John Glenn lived next to Reen and Scott Carpenter. Betty Grissom and Gus Grissom lived next to the Shiraz, and it was this very insular, almost Jetsons-like bubble world. Here's a picture of Reen Carpenter, who JFK once said he found the most attractive of the astronaut wives, and she was witty and would later write her own feminist-tinged newspaper column that was syndicated across the country, and in the early 70s sort of breaks out of this quintessential astronaut wife mold and is hosting her own feminist television talk show. But this is her during Scott's flight, and Walter Cronkite's just announced on the television that they've lost all track of her astronaut. And so it's just an absolutely nail-biting moment for her and her family. NASA did sort of want to portray the wives, and in conjunction with Life, as the quintessential 1950s, 1960s American housewife. So on top of your husband riding on a rocket into space, you also were supposed to be seen by the rest of the country as totally put together, sort of all-American apple pie. And until Scott's flight, all of the wives stayed back at home where the program began in Virginia or wherever they were living. And Asa felt it was going to be easier to control the story if you just had the press circus at home. But Reen was sort of rebellious, and she decided she was going to go down to Cocoa Beach for Scott's launch.